I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Great to have you back here on the program, Liz. Today we're talking about the San Antonio Four. We've never discussed this on the podcast, but what a topic. 4 women who were wrongfully convicted. They've now been exonerated, but on top of that, finally, their criminal convictions have been expunged. Basically, that means they're erased. We're going to talk about all that and more today, Elizabeth. Why don't you start off with an introduction to today's topic?
Yes, Chance, this is a very, very big case, one that began in 1994 here in San Antonio, and it is involving 4 women: Elizabeth Ramirez, who is now 44, Cassandra Rivera, 43, Christy Mayhew, 45, and Ana Vasquez, who is now 43. These women were accused of sexually assaulting Elizabeth Ramirez's nieces, who were then ages 7 and 9. And the women were accused of brutalizing these 2 little girls while they were visiting their aunt one weekend. They talked about satanic worship. They talked about being raped, with guns held against toward them, and with knives. And it became just a very, very big case here in San Antonio. Now, the women were convicted in 1998, and they served 15 years at least in prison. Now, the entire time, they swore that they were not guilty. And Chance, this particular case, the contributing factors that led to the exoneration, which happened in 2016, were false or misleading forensic evidence that had been presented during the trial, and of course, perjury or false accusation, because one of the girls, who is now an adult, came forward and said that she was instructed to lie by her father because he was going through a divorce with Elizabeth Ramirez's sister. It was a pretty contentious divorce, and he was wanting custody of the children. And this also happened around the time that all 4 women, and back then they were, I believe the oldest was 21 years old and the youngest was 19. They had all come out as lesbians to their family. So one of the things that came up was that one of the girls, the girl's father, wrongly accused them because he was upset that they were gay. And also, he had made some advances toward, I guess, his then sister-in-law that were spurned. So this was something that these women spent, oh my gosh, they are now in their 40s. They spent 15 years in prison. And in 2016, they were exonerated.
So they were exonerated 2 years ago. The highest criminal court in Texas said these are innocent women. However, that's interesting because now we're talking about their records being expunged. So it wasn't just so simple to say you didn't commit the crime and your life is back. There were several steps involved. Yes.
Well, first of all, let's get in a little bit of what the court said, because this actually was pretty. It's exciting for these women, obviously, but it's also pretty exciting as a court reporter to actually see how this process works. So this is the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and they, in their opinion, asserted in plain but forceful language that these women did not sexually assault these 2 girls. And at the time that this happened 2 years ago, experts called this rare and momentous, basically because 7 of the 9 appellate judges heard the case, and they all agreed that the women should get a new trial. And 5 of these appellate judges actually went a step further, who said these women are actually innocent. And that particular move paved the way for them to seek compensation for their imprisonment.
So let's talk about that then. Depending on the situation, depending on the case itself, compensation for being wrongly imprisoned can really range quite a lot. What kind of money did these 4 women receive?
Well, there's state law that actually dictates, and this is something that passed in Texas in 2009, that if you can prove that you were wrongfully convicted, that a person is entitled to $80,000 per year for each year that they were wrongfully imprisoned. So if you do the math, it looks like each of these women received about $1 million, plus other compensation, for their times that they spent in prison. But, in talking to some people about that sounds like a lot of money, and it's really not something that, people want to talk about. In my discussions with Mike Ware, who is the executive director of the Innocence Project of Texas, which was really instrumental in going to bat for these women here in San Antonio. He's telling me that, he acknowledged that this is what the state law dictates, that people are to receive, $80,000 for each year that someone was wrongfully imprisoned. But it's not really something that everybody wants to put out there because, people, may ask you for money and do things like that, try to, work toward, someone, pull at somebody's heartstrings, for money when, people find out that you've received, a payout. And, and a lot of people also say, that's, how can you put a price on being locked up wrongfully for so long? But, they did receive at least $1 million as far as we can figure as far as that state law dictates.
So it seems like there's kind of 3 points here on the road to these 4 women getting their lives back. They're exonerated by the courts. They receive compensation for being imprisoned for all those years. And then there's also expunction. So the fact that these convictions are no longer on their record, which must be amazing to have the feeling to know that that's no longer part of your record, but that also goes to getting a job, getting background checks. I mean, that could really prevent someone from living their life.
Exactly right, Chance. I'm so glad you brought that up because anybody who's applied for a job anywhere and even a place to live now, although I will admit I've been a homeowner for a long time, so I haven't filled out, a renter's application in a long time. But, when you look for a job, they'll ask you if you are a convicted felon. And I hear also that when you're looking for housing, they will ask you if you're a convicted felon. So, when you have that on your record, it's really, really hard to find a job, to find a place to live. And, it also becomes, even when I'm sitting in a courtroom and I'm watching a normal docket call and I see defendants go up before a judge and they talk about, these particular charges. They could be, lower level drug charges or theft charges or that sort of thing. The judges will always tell them, hey, it's going to be hard for you to get a job. And how are you going to break that cycle of, I stole because I didn't have any money? You have to be able to get a job so that you can get the things that you want in life, and you can't, get a job if you have a conviction. So expunction is a very big part of the exoneration process. So what it means to have your record expunged is that any and all governmental agencies that house information on criminal charges, indictments, arrests, or convictions that are related to the cases in which these women were found innocent, they must seal or destroy those records. So the entire process from exoneration to expunction can cost anywhere from $150,000 up to maybe even $200,000 per person. So the Innocence Project of Texas, which again has worked tirelessly for these women, paid for the whole thing for all of these women to have their records, expunged.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. So now that these three big points that we've been talking about, being exonerated, having it removed from your record, and then receiving, compensation for the time that they spent behind bars, since all three of those components are behind these four women, do you know what they're doing with their lives? Obviously, I think just the fact that they're in control of their lives is an amazing ability that they now have that they didn't have in the past. But what are they doing with that control?
This was just a really, really touching thing to see this week when this happened. I was speaking to Ana Vestiges, who's 43 years old now, and she told me she was 19 years old when all of this happened. So she has a really interesting gig now. She is now the Education and Outreach Director for the Innocence Project of Texas. And she is very, very passionate, obviously, about talking to people about the exoneration process. She is by far probably an excellent example of that because of her 15 years in prison. And it's funny because one of the things that the women had spoken about in past stories was they always maintained their innocence, even to the fact that when they were in prison, they would sometimes have to be put in solitary confinement because they would not participate in these particular type of therapy sessions or particular things that had been set up for people who had committed these offenses. And they'd get in trouble for that, and they'd have to get into solitary confinement because of it. But they were not at any point going to admit their guilt. I hear that Cassie Rivera now she has been working with a local attorney who is now a judge-elect. She works for Rosie Gonzalez, who is going to be the new judge of County Court at Law number 13 in Bexar County. And Christy Mayhew has completed veterinary tech training, and she after she was released from prison, she was hired by Toyota here in San Antonio, which does hire people who have criminal records. They should be lauded for that. So she no longer works for Toyota because she's moved to Houston to be near her mother. And she said that now that her record is expunged, she's going to be able to find a job actually as a veterinary technician, because she told me before, if anybody, you Google their names and all of these stories are going to come up that talks about their conviction for sexual assault. And and that leaves one more person. Elizabeth Ramirez, I hear, is taking a little bit of time off. She used to work at Toyota, Mike Ware told me, and now she's taken a little bit of time off, just basically to see what she wants to do. She also has a son who's in the Marine Corps, and now that her record has been expunged, she is going to be able to travel, hopefully to see him in the places where he is going to be stationed. So, you think about that. That's another thing, Chance. We talked about not being able to find a job, not being able to find a place to live. You also can't travel. And the women were telling me that this entire time that they were waiting they were going through the exoneration process and then waiting for the expunctions, they couldn't even have a glass of wine in their houses. They can't have anything. They had to be very, very regimented as far as like being in the right place at the right time and not being in the wrong place, because any little thing they could have been sent back, to prison. So, but now these women who were basically young girls, the youngest being 19, the oldest 21, now in their 40s are, basically they get a new chance in their life.
And then I think this is a really good way to end today's discussion, Elizabeth. I'm wondering if, with all the negative that's associated with this case, it's great that these 4 women now have their lives back, but they spent a lot of time behind bars. Anytime something like that happens, you hope that there's something people can point to and say, this is why the system failed, and we're not going to let this happen again. Is there anything that can be changed so that this doesn't happen to people in the future?
Well, I think one of the main things that has changed, Chance, is that they called it a junk science. Basically, there was testimony in the original trials that talked about scarring and other physical evidence of what they called sexual molestation in the genitalia of the girls. But, what's happened now is that, even a professor of pediatrics, Dr. Nancy Kellogg, when she testified that there was some scarring, evidence of healed scars, she also admitted that she could not really tell how old the scars were or whether they were the result of an accident. So through the years, people talk about how, when you're a kid, there are things that can happen, when you fall or other particular things like that might make something look like a crime was committed or in this case that someone was abused. But through the years, the particular science that they use now, they take that into consideration now, that you have to go a different direction. So I think a combination of things. You have 2 girls accusing, and then one as an adult recants, and basically said she couldn't live with herself, knowing that she lied. And then you have another one who didn't. So I think when you bring that together, evolving scientific processes to look at evidence, I think maybe that is changing. And, hopefully the way science has worked in criminal justice, we won't see that happen to anybody again.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me with some very important information for today's episode of The Docket. our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.